On the 2nd of January, 2020, a Sudanese Air Force Antonov An-12 lifted off from Geneina Airport in West Darfur, carrying a cargo hold and passenger bay full of people who had every reason to believe they would be home in Khartoum by nightfall. 5 minutes later, the aircraft was gone, and with it, 18 lives that had been folded into a single overloaded flight because of a scheduling change nobody could have predicted would matter so much. To understand why that plane was in the air at all, you have to understand what West Darfur looked like in the final days of 2019. The region had spent more than 15 years absorbing waves of ethnic violence between Arab and African communities, a conflict that international observers had already labeled with words like genocide and crimes against humanity back when the fighting first exploded in the early 2000s. By the time the calendar turned to 2020, the guns had never fully gone silent, and in the final week of December that year, clashes around Geneina flared again, leaving dozens dead and thousands displaced from their homes. Aid convoys and government delegations were shuttling in and out of the town, trying to stabilize a situation that had already spiraled past the point where local authorities could manage it alone. The aircraft assigned to fly medicine, food, and personnel into that crisis was an Antonov An-12, a design that first rolled off Soviet production lines in the late 1950s and had been hauling cargo across some of the world's roughest airstrips ever since. It is a boxy, high-winged, 4-engine turboprop built like a flying truck rather than a passenger jet, with a rear loading ramp that lets crews drive vehicles and pallets straight into the belly of the fuselage. Sudan's Air Force had operated variants of the type for decades, using them as the backbone of its logistics fleet because the aircraft could land on unpaved runways that would tear apart anything more delicate. That toughness came with a cost. The global fleet of An-12s was aging badly by 2020. Most of the airframes were pushing past their 40th or even 50th year of service. Spare parts were increasingly scarce, and maintenance regimes across many operators in Africa and the Middle East had a well-documented history of falling short of the standards applied to Western-built aircraft. On the morning of the 2nd, the Antonov touched down at Geneina, carrying humanitarian supplies destined for a population caught in the crossfire of renewed tribal violence. It offloaded its cargo, and then it was reconfigured for the return leg to Khartoum, a flight of roughly 800 kilometers across the width of the country. The manifest for that return leg tells its own story about who Sudan sends into its most volatile regions and how thin the margin can be when something goes wrong. 7 crew members were on board, the flight deck and loadmasters who kept the aircraft flying day after day into places most pilots would never choose to operate. 3 judges from Zalanje were also on the passenger list, jurists who had likely been sent into Darfur to help process cases connected to the unrest, now heading home after finishing whatever work had brought them there. Alongside them were 8 more civilians, among them 4 children, ordinary people who had found a seat on a military transport because it was the fastest and perhaps the only way out of a region gripped by conflict. In total, 18 souls were aboard when the wheels left the runway. There is a detail in the story of that flight that lingers longer than almost any other. Sudan's justice minister and the country's prosecutor general had originally been scheduled to be on that very aircraft. At the last moment, for reasons tied to work obligations back in the capital, both men changed their plans and did not board. It is the kind of detail that documentary narrators reach for because it captures, in the starkest possible terms, how arbitrary survival can be inside a system where transport is scarce, and the same handful of aircraft carried judges, aid workers, soldiers, and children on the same manifest, all trusting the same tired engines to get them home. Sudan, in that first week of January 2020, was a country trying to hold itself together after a year of extraordinary upheaval. Mass protests through the previous spring had ended 3 decades of rule under Omar al-Bashir, forcing his removal by the military in April and setting off months of tense negotiation between civilian protest leaders and army generals over what kind of government would replace him. A transitional arrangement had finally taken shape by the late summer, pairing civilian and military leadership in an uneasy power-sharing council meant to steer the country toward eventual elections. That transition consumed enormous political energy in Khartoum, and it left regions like Darfur, already neglected for years under the old government, with even less attention and even fewer resources than before. The renewed violence around Jenaina in the final days of December landed on a state apparatus that was distracted, cash-strapped, and still trying to figure out its own chain of command, conditions that made the kind of urgent, well-resourced emergency response seen in wealthier nations essentially impossible. The Antonov climbed away from Jenaina into the hot, hazy air of West Darfur. Witnesses on the ground would later describe what happened next as sudden, a transport aircraft that had barely reached altitude when it began to fall out of the sky. Local reports placed the crash site several kilometers from the runway, close enough that the sound and the smoke were heard and seen by people in the surrounding area within moments. Emergency responders converged on the wreckage to find a scene that offered almost no room for hope. The fuselage had come apart on impact, and what fire followed left little of the aircraft intact enough to identify from a distance. Rescue crews searching through the debris did not find a single survivor. The Sudanese army's confirmation of casualties arrived in stages, as it often does after a disaster in a conflict zone with limited communications infrastructure. The earliest reports out of the region, cited by aviation trackers and international wire services within hours of the crash, spoke of 15 dead. As identification proceeded through the following day, the official count from Sudan's military spokesman rose to 18, a figure that has stood since as the accepted total. Among the confirmed dead were the 7 crew members who had flown the aircraft in and back out of Jenaina that day, the 3 judges returning from their work in Zalingay, and 8 civilians, 4 of them children who should have had nothing more dangerous ahead of them that afternoon than the ordinary discomfort of a long flight home. News of the crash spread quickly through Sudanese social media before it reached international outlets in full. Images purporting to show the scorched wreckage circulated within hours, showing twisted metal and a blackened hull barely recognizable as an aircraft. Local journalists and activists shared what fragments of information they could gather: names of crew members, photographs of judges who had been well-known figures in Zalingay's legal community, and appeals for prayers for the families now waiting for confirmation of what had happened to their relatives. For a country already exhausted by years of political upheaval, having only recently emerged from the mass protests that toppled longtime President Omar al-Bashir less than a year earlier, the crash landed as one more blow in a season that had offered very little relief. Sudan's military spokesman addressed reporters in the hours after the crash, confirming the death toll and the composition of those on board without offering a definitive explanation for what had caused the aircraft to go down. He noted that the flight had been carrying out a humanitarian mission, delivering medicine and food supplies to a region in the grip of ethnic violence, before making its return journey to Khartoum. He announced that an investigation into the cause of the crash had been launched, language that would prove to be the last substantive update the Sudanese government offered publicly on the matter for a long time afterward. That silence is itself part of the story. Aviation disasters involving well-resourced airlines in stable countries tend to produce detailed final reports within a year or two, complete with flight data recorder analysis, maintenance histories, and specific findings about mechanical failure, pilot error, or some combination of the two. Crashes involving aging military transports in conflict-affected regions of the developing world rarely receive that kind of scrutiny. No public findings from the Sudanese investigation into the Jenaina crash were ever released in detail. Aviation safety databases that track incidents of this kind list the cause as undetermined, a designation that reflects not the absence of a cause, but the absence of a published explanation. Given the age of the airframe, the punishing conditions under which Sudan's Antonov fleet operated, and the country's long-documented history of technical failures across its Chinese and Russian-sourced military aircraft, Informed observers have pointed to mechanical failure as the most probable explanation, though without an official report, that conclusion remains an inference rather than a confirmed fact. It is worth placing this crash inside the broader record of the An-12 as a type, because the aircraft's history in African and Middle Eastern service is long and troubled. Variants of the Antonov have gone down in Sudan before and after this incident, including an earlier crash at the very same Janaina airfield years prior, when an overloaded aircraft carrying ammunition ran into trouble on landing. Across the wider region, operators flying aging An-12s have suffered a long string of accidents traced to double engine failures, structural fatigue, overloading, and maintenance shortfalls, a pattern that international aviation bodies have flagged repeatedly without producing meaningful change on the ground. The aircraft remains in service in these environments precisely because it is cheap to operate and forgiving of primitive infrastructure. The same qualities that make it valuable also make it a vehicle that keeps flying long after safer nations would have grounded it. The economics behind that continued reliance are simple and largely unforgiving. A modern Western-built transport aircraft capable of operating from unpaved strips costs many times what an aging Antonov does to acquire, and its parts and specialized maintenance require hard currency and access to manufacturer support networks that sanctioned or cash-poor governments often cannot secure. Sudan spent years under various forms of international sanction, restrictions that cut off easy access to spare parts and technical support for aircraft sourced from Western manufacturers, while pushing its military toward continued reliance on Soviet-era and Chinese-built airframes that could be kept flying through improvisation, cannibalized parts, and maintenance crews trained to work around chronic shortages rather than within factory specifications. That improvisation kept a logistics network running that would otherwise have collapsed, but it did so by accepting a level of mechanical risk that would be considered intolerable almost anywhere else in the world. Every flight into a place like Janaina carried that risk quietly along with its cargo, invisible to the passengers boarding, because it had become simply the ordinary cost of moving people and supplies through a country where there was rarely a safer alternative available. The human cost of the Janaina crash did not end with the 18 people who died that afternoon. Families in Zalingay lost judges who had spent careers navigating a legal system stretched thin by conflict and scarcity. Families of the crew lost men who had built careers flying some of the most demanding routes in the country, moving supplies into places that safer, better-funded air forces would never have attempted to service. And families of the 8 civilians, 4 of them children, lost relatives who had simply been trying to get out of a war zone the fastest way they could find. The judges who had originally been scheduled for the flight, the justice minister and the prosecutor general who changed their plans at the last moment, were left to carry the particular weight of having narrowly missed the very disaster that claimed colleagues traveling in their place. In the years since, the crash has settled into the long, largely undocumented catalog of accidents that mark the operational history of Sudan's Air Force and of the Antonov An-12 more broadly. It surfaces in aviation safety databases as a single entry among hundreds involving the type, a few sentences summarizing what happened, how many died, and the fact that no cause was ever formally established. It does not carry the same public memory as disasters involving commercial airliners in wealthier nations, the kind that prompt congressional hearings, manufacturer recalls, and years of documentary retrospectives. There was no black box recovery announced to the public, no international review board flown in to comb through the wreckage, no press conference walking survivors and journalists through a reconstructed timeline of mechanical failure. What there was, instead, was a brief flurry of local and regional news coverage, a spokesman's statement, a rising body count as identification proceeded, and then silence. The same silence that has closed over so many other crashes involving aging transport aircraft, flying humanitarian and military missions into the world's most dangerous corners. That silence is not unique to Sudan. It reflects a global pattern in which the safety of air travel is heavily weighted toward the wealthy and the stable, where regulatory bodies, insurance requirements, and public accountability combine to keep commercial aviation in developed nations extraordinarily safe, while military and cargo aviation in conflict zones and low-income countries continues to rely on airframes that are decades past the point where a comparable aircraft in Europe or North America would have been retired. The Antonov An-12 that went down outside Janaina on the 2nd of January 2020 was, by the time of the crash, already older than most of the people who died aboard it. It had likely passed through multiple operators and multiple modifications over a service life stretching back to the era of the Cold War, carrying cargo and passengers across some of the harshest flying environments on Earth, long after the engineers who designed it in the Antonov Bureau in Kyiv had passed the aircraft's care into the hands of successive generations of mechanics, working with dwindling resources and aging tooling. For the people of West Darfur, the crash arrived as one more loss layered on top of a conflict that had already displaced hundreds of thousands and killed untold numbers over more than a decade and a half of intermittent violence. The aircraft that fell from the sky that afternoon had been trying to help, carrying medicine and food into a town under strain, and carrying judges and civilians away from danger on its return. That it failed in the attempt, taking 18 lives with it, stands as a grim reminder of how fragile the infrastructure supporting humanitarian response can be in places where the state itself is stretched to its limits, and where the machines relied upon to hold together a fraying social fabric are themselves held together by little more than necessity and the absence of any better alternative. The three judges from Zelingé deserve a particular note in any accounting of this crash, because their presence on that flight speaks to how thinly stretched Sudan's justice system had become in Darfur during those years of conflict. Zelingé, the capital of central Darfur, had spent more than a decade functioning as a hub for legal proceedings tied to displacement, land disputes, and the endless low-grade violence that flared between communities across the region. Judges assigned there carried caseloads shaped as much by the ongoing conflict as by ordinary civil and criminal matters, and travel between Darfur's scattered towns and the capital in Khartoum was itself a hazardous undertaking, often possible only by military aircraft because roads through the region remained unsafe or simply impassable. Losing 3 members of that judicial community in a single crash represented a meaningful blow to a legal system already operating far below capacity. One more example of how infrastructure failures in Sudan's periphery rippled outward into institutions that had nothing directly to do with aviation at all. The crew members deserve equal remembering, even though their names rarely made it into international coverage of the crash. Flying for Sudan's Air Force in Darfur during this period meant accepting routine exposure to both the mechanical uncertainties of an aging fleet and the political volatility of the region itself, since transport aircraft moving through active conflict zones have historically been vulnerable to more than just structural failure. These were professionals who had built entire careers on exactly the kind of unglamorous, high-risk logistics work that keeps a fractured country functioning, ferrying food, medicine, judges, soldiers, and civilians alike into and out of places that international aid organizations often could not reach by any other means. Their deaths, folded into a total of 18 and summarized in a handful of wire service sentences, represented the loss of exactly the kind of institutional knowledge and hard-won experience that is nearly impossible to replace quickly in an Air Force already struggling with resources. In the weeks after the crash, attention in Khartoum moved on quickly, pulled by the ongoing work of the political transition and by the next crisis competing for the government's limited bandwidth. There is no public record of a memorial service organized by the state, no monument commissioned, no annual commemoration established to mark the 2nd of January as a date of national mourning. For a country navigating the aftermath of revolution, economic collapse, and continuing regional conflict all at once, A single transport plane crash, however tragic, simply did not carry enough political weight to command sustained attention. That is not a judgment on the value of the lives lost, but a reflection of how triage works in a state under this much strain, where finite resources for investigation, remembrance, and reform get allocated according to a calculus that rarely favors accidents involving unnamed crew members and unlisted civilians in a remote western province. No memorial marks the crash site outside Janaina in any way visible to the wider world. No annual remembrance draws international attention back to the 18 names lost that day. What remains is the record, thin as it is, scattered across aviation safety archives, a handful of contemporaneous news reports, and the memories of families in Zalingay and Khartoum who still carry the particular grief of having lost someone to a flight that should have been routine. The Antonov An-12 crash at Janaina Airport belongs to a category of aviation disaster that receives almost no lasting public attention, not because the loss was any less real, but because the people who died were far from the centers of power and privilege that usually determine which tragedies get remembered and which quietly disappear into a database entry marked cause undetermined.